You're listening to History's Edge audio documentary, The Rise of the Roman Army, Part 1. Long before the eagle flew over deserts and mountains, before disciplined legions carved roads into the earth, Rome was just a village beside a river. It had no empire, no legions, and no name the world feared. Its people lived among wolves, surrounded by enemies, haunted by omens in the sky and whispers from the gods. But from this brutal beginning, something remarkable was born. A military system so adaptable, so relentless, it would conquer the known world. This is the story of how that army was forged. Not in marble halls or grand forums, but in tribal feuds, wooden palisades, and blood-soaked fields. A story of kings and citizens, of sacred shields, borrowed weapons, and wars that reshaped the Roman mind. Welcome to the rise of the Roman army, the origin of the most feared military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Chapter 1. Before the legion. Before there were legions, there were clans. The Rome we know, the one of emperors, marble columns, and endless roads, did not yet exist. In its place stood a cluster of huts on a hill beside the Tiber River. Smoke drifted from thatched roofs. Chickens scratched the dirt. Children chased pigs through the mud. And in the distance, wolves howled in the wooded hills of Latium. Rome, if it could even be called that, was just one of many tribal settlements competing for survival. The people farmed, fought, and prayed under skies they believed were watched by gods. Life was short, brutal, and deeply spiritual. Every storm, every harvest, every battle was a message from the divine. Warfare was not yet a profession. It was a duty, seasonal, sacred, and savage. Every man who could lift a spear was expected to fight when called. There were no uniforms, no fixed ranks, and no standard formations. Only war bands, bound by blood and honor, charging into battle for land, cattle, and revenge. These groups were often led by chiefs or elders, but leadership could shift in times of war. The right to command belonged to those with strength, divine favor, and sometimes a legacy earned in single combat. The greatest glory came from the spolia opima, the armor of a fallen enemy leader, stripped in ritual after a one-on-one duel. According to Roman tradition, this honor was so sacred that it could only be claimed when the Roman commander personally killed his opposite. In over 1,000 years of Roman warfare, it was achieved just 3 times. Even before Rome became a kingdom, its people believed in omens and sacred rites. Battle was never waged without divine consultation. Before any campaign, augurs were summoned. They observed the flight patterns of birds, listened for thunder from specific directions, and even released sacred chickens to see how eagerly they ate. If the signs were bad, the attack was delayed or cancelled entirely. The gods were believed to dwell in groves and hills, and warfare was as much about pleasing them as it was about defeating enemies. To offend the divine order was to invite disaster. In this early world, bronze weapons were still common, and the Iron Age had only just begun. Shields were round and often decorated with family symbols. Helmets varied wildly, depending on wealth. A chieftain might wear a crested bronze cap, while a farmer might fight bareheaded. Most of what we know about this time comes from archaeology and myth, but one thing is clear. The seeds of Roman military discipline were planted long before the legions ever marched. They began here, in mud, superstition, and tribal violence, when Rome was still a whisper among wolves. The earliest enemies of Rome were not distant empires or mighty kings. They were neighbors. Tribes like the Sabines, the Volsci, and the Aequi raided Roman land and clashed with her people long before Carthage, located in modern-day Tunis, ever rose. These conflicts were brutal and personal. Livestock was stolen, fields were burned, and captives were often taken not just for ransom, but for sacrifice or slavery. It was a cycle of raid and retaliation, where alliances shifted as quickly as the seasons. To survive, early Romans turned to both tradition and adaptation. Their weapons were simple: spears, short swords, and round shields made of wood and hide. Iron was still rare and precious, and bronze remained in use, often recycled from the armor of the defeated. Fighting was done in loose bands, often family-based. There were no standing armies, only citizen warriors who answered the call when the elders summoned them. Each tribe had its own customs, but many rituals were shared across the Latin people. Warriors wore charms and amulets into battle. Some smeared their shields with ash, others painted their faces with ochre or blood. These were not tactics. They were symbols of protection, of power, of fear. But even in these chaotic early wars, something was already forming. A pattern. Romans were learning from every defeat. When a tactic failed, they remembered. When a weapon worked, they copied it. Nowhere was this clearer than in their conflict with Veii, a powerful Etruscan city just north of the Tiber. Veii, located in what is now the village of Isola Farnese, was Rome's first true military rival. The Romans fought Veii for generations, learning siegecraft, fortification, and the value of persistence. From these endless skirmishes, Rome's military identity began to take shape. It was not yet a machine, not yet legions marching in step, but the fire had been lit. In the blood and smoke of tribal warfare, the future Roman army was gathering its strength. Chapter 2. The Birth of Roman Arms. In the earliest Roman myths, war and power were inseparable. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, was not only a king but a warrior. According to tradition, he built his army from fugitives and shepherds, teaching them to fight with discipline and fury. The first army was not built for conquest, it was built for survival. Under the kings of Rome, the warrior identity of the city began to take a more structured form. Service in war was a sacred obligation. Men were grouped by their wealth, not by skill or merit. Those who could afford horses became cavalry. Those with enough to buy bronze armor served in the front lines. The poorest marched behind, with slings, javelins, or bare courage. Weapons were not issued by the state. Each man brought his own arms, passed down from father to son or forged by local smiths. Spears, short swords, and round shields made of wood or hide were the standard. Bronze helmets and breastplates were a luxury, but even the poorest fighters carried symbols: carved animal bones, etched stones, or painted crests, to declare their bravery and lineage. The military was also a mirror of politics. Kings led the army themselves. Victory gave them legitimacy. Defeat meant shame or even exile. In this early period, war was not yet about expansion. It was about territory, honor, and appeasing the gods. Sacred rituals marked every campaign. Before battle, animals were sacrificed, omens read, and vows made to Jupiter and Mars. Rome's military culture grew out of these rites. Combat was not just violence. It was a contract between the people, the king, and the gods. To march into war was to offer yourself as part of a larger divine order. These early armies were not yet legions, but the foundations were forming. Rome was beginning to see itself not just as a tribe, but as a warrior society, one that believed victory came through discipline, piety, and courage. Rome's early kings did more than lead in war. They shaped the structure of Roman military service for centuries to come. Chief among them was Servius Tullius, the sixth king of Rome, who reformed the way the army was organized. According to tradition, he introduced the centuriate system, dividing the male population into units based on wealth and age. This system determined not only a man's place in battle, but also his role in the political assembly. In Rome, military service and voting rights were born together. Under this model, the richest citizens formed the cavalry, the equites, riding into battle with crested helmets and bronze breastplates. Behind them stood the heavily armed infantry, men wealthy enough to afford full armor and spears. The lighter ranks, those with minimal equipment, filled the rear, supporting the line with slings, darts, or javelins. The poorest class, Those with no gear at all were not called to serve. They were seen as a burden in battle and irrelevant in politics. This early army was built not around units of equal strength, but around social obligation. It was not yet a tactical force. It was a mirror of the Roman state, unequal, layered, and symbolic. Each soldier's gear reflected his place in society. The Roman state itself took its first steps towards centralizing military power. Armories were established. Sacred weapons, like the encelia, a divine shield believed to have fallen from the sky, were preserved in temples. These relics became symbols of Rome's divine protection, paraded during festivals and carried into battle to rally courage and favor from the gods. Training, though still informal, began to take shape. Young nobles learned to fight on horseback, while foot soldiers drilled in public spaces or rural fields. Physical strength, endurance, and courage were all expected, but even more important was discipline. The ability to hold formation, follow orders, and obey the will of the commander was beginning to emerge as a Roman ideal. The Roman army of this time was not yet professional, not yet feared across the Mediterranean, but it was no longer just a tribal warband. It was a civic institution, an extension of Rome's laws, beliefs, and class divisions. By the time the monarchy fell in 509 BCE, the Roman army had become a force not just of weapons, but of identity. Chapter 3. Enemies at the Gate. Before Rome ever sent its legions across the sea, it was surrounded by enemies at home. The Italian peninsula was a fractured land, carved into pockets of hill tribes, coastal settlers, and rival city-states. And in this rugged terrain, warfare was constant. Every harvest, every trade route, every pasture could become a battleground. Among Rome's earliest threats were the Sabines, a fierce mountain people to the northeast. The Sabines were known not only for their stubborn resistance, but for the deep role they played in Roman legend. Romulus himself was said to have stolen their daughters to fill the new city with wives. This myth masked a deeper truth, that the Sabines were rivals, close in culture and strength, and their absorption into Rome would take generations of warfare and diplomacy. To the south and east were the Volsci and Aequi, two aggressive tribes that harassed Roman territory for over a century. They struck fast from the hills, burned fields, and retreated before Rome's forces could answer. These enemies forced Rome to build roads not for commerce, but for speed, to reach frontiers before they were breached. These were not wars of conquest, they were wars of survival. Rome's borders were not fixed lines, but shifting zones marked by ditches, watchposts, and memory. A hill, lost one season, might be retaken the next. Small towns were wiped out and rebuilt. Entire families vanished between skirmishes. The violence was so constant that Roman children were raised not only on tales of heroes, but on the names of villages taken and lost. Every enemy Rome faced in these early years taught her something. From the Sabines, she learned the value of integration. From the Volsci and Aequi, she learned the need for rapid response. And from the land itself, steep, forested, and unforgiving, she learned that roads, scouts, and discipline would matter more than size. By the 5th century BCE, Rome was no longer just reacting to threats. It was starting to shape the frontier, to look beyond the river, and to prepare for the kind of wars that would stretch far beyond the hills of Latium. The wars against the Volsci, Aequi, and Sabines were not clean victories. They were drawn out, bitter campaigns. No grand battle decided the outcome. Instead, it was persistence that won. Rome fought, lost, rebuilt, and fought again. The city's survival was not secured by genius tactics or overwhelming power, but by its refusal to surrender. Rome's soldiers, drawn from citizens, learned to expect war not as an event, but as a condition of life. Military service was nearly constant. One campaign ended, and another began. Fields went unplanted, children grew up fatherless, and temples held more vows than thanks. This was the real cost of Rome's rise, not gold or glory, but endurance. One of the most valuable lessons came not from enemies, but from geography. The tribes that fought Rome often controlled the highlands and forests, places where formations broke and visibility was poor. Ambushes were frequent. Victory depended on knowing the terrain, using scouts and responding fast. To meet these challenges, Rome slowly began changing its infrastructure. Temporary camps became more organized, roads were extended, messenger systems were created. Rome did not yet have a professional army, but it was learning to move and react like one. Flexibility, not brute strength, became the Roman advantage. Rome also began offering alliance as a weapon. Instead of destroying every enemy, Rome sometimes absorbed them. The Sabines were a prime example. After years of hostility, many were given citizenship and folded into the Roman state. These former enemies brought their own military traditions, which Rome studied and sometimes adopted. By the end of the 5th century BCE, Rome had expanded its influence across much of Latium. The city had not yet claimed an empire, but it had laid the foundation for one. It had survived wave after wave of attack. Its army was harder, its leadership more experienced, and its ambitions beginning to stretch beyond defense. Soon, Rome would no longer wait for enemies to come to its gates. It would start marching toward theirs. Chapter 4: The Kings and the Shield. The Roman army did not spring into the world fully formed. It was shaped over time by rulers who saw warfare not only as a necessity, but as a tool of power and identity. Among these rulers, the most influential was Servius Tullius, Rome's 6th king, whose reforms laid the groundwork for Rome's class-based military. But long before those structures were formalized, Rome's earliest kings had already begun molding the army into a reflection of the state. According to Roman tradition, the first army was founded by Romulus himself. It consisted of 100 picked men, called the Celeres, a personal bodyguard that would later inspire elite cavalry formations. These men were not professionals, but chosen for strength, loyalty, and noble lineage. Warfare under the early kings was tribal, personal, and sacred. The king was both commander and priest, leading the people into battle with divine authority. Under Numa Pompilius, Rome's 2nd king, the emphasis shifted from conquest to ritual. Numa established many of the religious offices and rites that surrounded war. He created the fetial priests, who oversaw declarations of war and peace. No Roman army was to march without a formal religious sanction. Even war in Rome required paperwork from the gods. Later, under kings like Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, Rome resumed its aggressive posture. These rulers led campaigns against neighboring Latin towns and the powerful Etruscans. Tullus was credited with the destruction of Alba Longa, Rome's cousin city, and the forced relocation of its population into Rome itself. These victories were not just territorial, they were symbolic. Each enemy defeated became a thread woven into Rome's growing identity. Under Ancus Marcius, military expansion was paired with infrastructure. He ordered the construction of Rome's first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, and founded the port of Ostia to secure access to the sea. These were strategic moves, allowing for troop movement, supply routes, and future naval operations. Rome's kings were beginning to think beyond ritual and revenge. They were building a military system with reach. By the time of Servius Tullius, the army had become not just a force of strength, but a reflection of the Roman social order. Wealth and rank determined both your position on the battlefield and your influence in politics. The military and the republic were beginning to merge into one. What began as a king's guard had become the body of the people, still fractured, still developing, but unmistakably Roman. Servius Tullius didn't just reorganize the Roman army, he reshaped the city to support it. Roman tradition credits him with building the Servian Wall, which defined the city's new boundaries and protected its growing population. He also divided Rome into local administrative regions called tribus. These districts were more than civic divisions. They were designed to organize military service, assign men to command, and respond quickly to threats from outside the city. Rome's sacred calendar evolved alongside this military structure. Public rituals now honored not only the gods but the military duties of citizenship. One such observance, the Regifugium, remembered the fall of the monarchy and the founding of the republic. It served as a warning and a celebration, linking the power of war to the authority of the people. Servius also made the census a requirement. Every 5 years, Roman men had to report their property, their family, and their readiness to serve. If a man failed to appear, he was stripped of his political rights. The census became more than a record. It was a system for assigning men to their place in the army, and for reminding citizens that their duty to fight and their right to speak were bound together. In military planning, Rome began preparing more deliberately for long-term threats. Citizen reserves were organized to support the standing forces during emergencies. These were not professional soldiers, but former fighters who could be called up again. This gave Rome a strategic edge over neighboring cities, whose armies disappeared after harvest season. Beyond the walls, the army was starting to shape the countryside. Roads were cleared and guarded. Camps became semi-permanent posts. Temples and military gathering places were often built side by side. The army was no longer something that only appeared when danger came. It had become part of Rome's identity, its rhythm, and its design. By the time the kings were overthrown, the army was no longer just a tool of monarchy. It had become an institution embedded in the daily life of the people. The shield no longer served a king. It served the state. Chapter 5. The Republic Rises. The Roman monarchy fell in the year 509 before the Common Era. It did not collapse in chaos. It transformed with precision. The same citizen army that once fought for a king now defended the rights of a republic. But the republic was no democracy. Power passed into the hands of the patricians, the wealthy landowning class, and with it, command of the legions. Rome's army did not disband with the monarchy. It adapted. The office of king was replaced by 2 annually elected magistrates called consuls, who shared power and military leadership. No single man was trusted with command for too long. Every campaign now reflected the politics of the republic. Commanders needed the support of the Senate, the votes of the people, and the loyalty of their soldiers. This new system changed the way Rome went to war. The consuls led, but they were not kings. Their authority ended with the calendar year. If a war dragged on, it was the republic, not the commander, that had to reappoint or replace him. It was a check on ambition, but it also created tension. Political rivalry seeped into the chain of command. Glory in war meant glory in Rome, and ambitious men learned quickly that battlefield victories could win them public office. Yet the army itself remained rooted in tradition. Citizen soldiers still served without pay, bringing their own equipment, returning home after each campaign. Service was a duty, a mark of manhood, and a path to honor. But with more wars came longer marches, foreign campaigns, and more frequent absences. The burden on the Roman farmer soldier began to grow. To maintain military readiness, the Republic relied on strict conscription laws. Men of fighting age were required to appear for duty when called, or face public shame and legal punishment. This expectation forged a sense of unity, not of loyalty to a general, but to Rome itself. The Republic made the city, not the man, the center of the soldier's loyalty. As Rome fought its way across Latium and beyond, this new balance of power, between elected leaders, citizen armies, and the Senate, created something rare in the ancient world, a military machine that was not personal, not professional, and not imperial. It was Roman, and it was just beginning to wake. The early republic faced enemies on every side. The fall of the monarchy had not made Rome safer. In fact, it made her more vulnerable. Neighboring cities saw an opportunity to strike while the new system was untested. The Latin League, the Etruscans, and the Sabines all challenged Roman control in the region, but the Republic had one advantage that most of its rivals lacked: organization. With consuls, a senate, and defined chains of command, Rome could coordinate multiple campaigns at once. The citizen army, drawn from a growing population, allowed Rome to field large forces without the need for mercenaries. Still, this system had weaknesses. Since military service was unpaid, long campaigns strained the livelihoods of ordinary soldiers. Men left their farms and returned to find them ruined. Families fell into debt. Tensions between the patricians and the common people, or plebeians, grew steadily. The plebeians demanded debt relief, land reform, and legal rights. Their protests would reshape the Republic as much as war ever did. In response to this unrest, the Roman army itself began to reflect the growing divide. While the upper classes continued to serve in the front lines and command posts, poorer citizens were increasingly used for labor, skirmishing, and support roles. These men still risked their lives, but they had no power in the Senate and no formal protection under the law. This pressure eventually led to one of Rome's earliest social revolts, the secession of the plebs. In this act of protest, plebeian soldiers walked out of the city and refused to fight. They knew the Republic could not survive without them. It was not a battle of swords, but of silence, and it worked. The result was the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a political office designed to protect the rights of the common people. It was a civilian role, but its origin was military. The very structure of the Roman Republic, even its legal reforms, was shaped by the army and those who served in it. Rome's expansion was never just a military conquest. It was also a struggle for balance between power and service. The Republic grew not only through victories on the field, but through the voices of its citizens, especially those who carried shields. Chapter 6. From Phalanx to Flexibility. In the earliest days of the Republic, Rome borrowed heavily from its neighbours. Nowhere was this more visible than on the battlefield. The Roman army of the 5th and early 4th centuries BCE fought in the Greek-style phalanx, a tight, rectangular formation of spear-armed infantry, standing shield to shield in rigid ranks. It was effective on flat ground, especially in the open plains of Latium. But Italy was not Greece. Roman enemies, like the Samnites and the Volsci, often fought in hills, forests, and broken terrain where the phalanx began to falter. Its tight formation made it powerful but inflexible. If disrupted, it collapsed. And in the mountains, disruption was constant. The turning point came with the Samnite Wars, a series of brutal conflicts that lasted for decades. The Samnites, who lived in the rugged highlands of central Italy, fought in looser, more mobile units. They used ambushes, retreats, and counterattacks. Their style of warfare was disorganized by Greek standards, but it was deadly in the Italian terrain. Rome suffered devastating losses during these wars. One of the most infamous defeats came at the Battle of the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was trapped in a narrow mountain pass and forced to surrender without a fight. The humiliation left a mark, but it also forced a change. Rome learned, not just from victory, but from failure. The rigidity of the phalanx gave way to something new. The army began to experiment with a more flexible formation, one that could adjust to terrain, respond to threats on the flanks, and operate in smaller groups. This was the birth of the manipular system, a revolutionary approach that would eventually dominate Roman battlefield tactics. But change came slowly. The Romans were conservative by nature, and new ideas took time to gain ground. In this first phase of reform, it wasn't yet a fully formed doctrine. It was a pattern taking shape, forged not in the forum, but in the fire of Italy's most punishing wars. The transition from phalanx to manipular formation was more than a tactical shift. It reflected a deeper change in how the Roman army thought, moved, and trained. The new system divided men into smaller, more mobile groups called maniples, each roughly 120 soldiers, arranged in 3 distinct lines. These lines were not just random. They represented age, experience, and purpose. At the front stood the hastati, young and relatively untested soldiers, armed with throwing spears called pila and short swords. Behind them stood the principes, older and more experienced men with stronger armour. At the rear stood the triarii, veterans who fought with long spears and only engaged if the first 2 lines failed. This structure created flexibility without sacrificing discipline. Each line could rotate, absorb pressure, or exploit weaknesses in the enemy. The manipular system also introduced gaps between units, arranged in a checkerboard pattern. These gaps weren't flaws. They were features. They allowed for retreat, reinforcement, and lateral movement on the battlefield. For the first time, Roman infantry could adapt in real time, responding to cavalry charges, ambushes, or terrain shifts with far more agility than the old phalanx ever allowed. Training evolved as well. Soldiers now drilled in unit tactics, not just formation standing. Officers were taught to give commands quickly, not rely on a single general's voice. The Roman army was becoming a battlefield machine, modular, coordinated, and increasingly professional in its expectations. Even weaponry reflected the change. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear designed to bend on impact and prevent reuse, became a standard tool. Soldiers would hurl their pila to break an enemy line before closing in with the gladius, a short stabbing sword ideal for close combat. Shields grew taller and more curved, giving better protection in broken formations. This wasn't just a battlefield innovation, it was cultural. The manipular system reinforced Roman ideals of duty, hierarchy, and endurance. Young men proved themselves at the front. Veterans anchored the rear. Each soldier knew his place, and each earned it through service. The structure mirrored Roman society itself, layered, mobile, and brutally efficient. By the end of the Samnite Wars, the manipular system had proven itself in every kind of terrain Italy could offer. Rome no longer had to fear the forests, hills, or passes that once crippled her armies. She had found a system that turned flexibility into strength, and turned defeats into doctrine. Chapter 7. A City of Stone. As Rome's army evolved into a tool of conquest, the city itself began to reflect its ambitions. The wooden huts and dirt paths of earlier centuries gave way to stone temples, paved roads, and fortified walls. This was not just civic development. It was strategic. Rome was turning itself into a war capital, a city built not only to govern, but to endure and expand. Central to this transformation was the use of local volcanic stone, known as tuff. Quarried from the surrounding hills of Latium, tuff was soft when cut but hardened with exposure to air. It allowed Rome to build more quickly, more cheaply, and more durably than many of its rivals. Entire city districts were rebuilt using tuff blocks. Fortifications were thickened, temples elevated, and roads lined with stone gutters and raised sidewalks. One of the first major uses of tuff was the reinforcement of the Servian Wall, initially begun under the kings, but vastly expanded during the Republic. This wall, stretching over 11 kilometers, stood as both a defensive structure and a symbol of permanence. Where other cities relied on seasonal defenses, Rome now had an enduring line of stone, manned by citizens and integrated into the city's layout. Temples, too, took on new prominence. These were not just places for quiet prayer, they were deeply woven into the military and political life of the Republic. Temples to Mars, Jupiter, and Bellona were built close to the gates of the city or near the Campus Martius, where troops assembled before campaigns. Offerings were made, omens were read, soldiers passed under sacred porticos before marching off to war. Religion did not limit the army, it legitimized it. The Forum Romanum, still maturing in this period, became the nerve center of both war and governance. Here, consuls gave speeches, recruits were assigned to legions, and generals returned to demand triumphs. Victory was not celebrated in a distant palace, but in public view, between the curia, the temples, and the rostra where the people gathered. Rome made military success a civic ritual. Even street design reflected military logic. Roads like the Via Latina, and soon the Via Appia, were engineered not simply to connect towns, but to move armies. Their paving stones, drainage systems, and carefully measured gradients allowed for fast, stable transport of men, wagons, and messengers across difficult terrain. These roads were tools of control. Rome also developed permanent supply depots, granaries, and cisterns both inside the city and along key routes. These weren't makeshift stockpiles. They were planned. Rome wasn't just preparing to march, it was preparing to sustain war across multiple fronts. As the army grew more flexible, the city grew more permanent. This was no accident. Roman strategy extended beyond the battlefield. It was architectural, spiritual, and administrative. Every stone set in place was a message that Rome did not intend to retreat. It no longer looked like a village. It was becoming the capital of a civilization. Rome's transformation into a city of stone was not just visual, it was a carefully engineered strategy. Beneath its temples and fortifications, a network of military infrastructure began to take shape, one that would connect, supply, and extend Roman control across the peninsula. Among the most important of these developments was the construction of the Via Appia, or the Appian Way, built in 312 BCE under the direction of the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. This was Rome's first true highway, a massive stone road that began in the city of Rome and stretched southeast to Capua, eventually reaching Brundisium, which is modern-day Brindisi, a major Roman port on the Adriatic Sea. The Via Appia wasn't a local path. It was a military corridor designed for speed, durability, and control. These roads were engineered with deep foundations, layered gravel, and tightly fitted paving stones. Their surfaces drained water effectively and could support the weight of legions, pack animals, and carts year-round. Milestones were placed at regular intervals. Guard posts and way stations appeared along the route. Wherever the road led, Rome followed. Alongside the roads came bridges, many of which replaced dangerous wooden crossings with arched stone spans. Rivers that once slowed or blocked military campaigns were now strategic crossings. Roman engineers could survey, grade, and build terrain to suit the army's needs. Warfare wasn't just fought with swords anymore. It was fought with surveying tools and stonecutters. As Rome pushed outward, it planted new colonies to hold captured territory. These settlements were designed with Roman precision. Streets intersected at right angles. Forums mirrored the one in Rome. Public spaces included temples, wells, and walls. These colonies weren't just homes for settlers. They were miniature Romes built to extend culture, law, and supply lines deeper into Italy. The city itself kept pace. The Aqua Appia, Rome's first aqueduct, also began during this period. Though modest by later standards, it brought a steady supply of water into the city. That water supported citizens, livestock, and soldiers. Even water management became part of Rome's military machine. Cleaner troops meant fewer diseases, fewer delays, and greater endurance. Storage depots and granaries were also built with war in mind. Supplies no longer had to be gathered from scratch. They could be pre-positioned along the roads. Rome wasn't just reacting anymore. It was preparing. Engineers became as vital as generals. Logistics became a form of power. Every block of stone laid in this era carried weight far beyond its size. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and colonies weren't just public works. They were weapons. Rome's future conquests would be won not only by force, but by infrastructure. And that future was now set in stone. Chapter 8. Water and Fire. War did not just shape Rome's soldiers. It shaped the very way they lived and survived. In a city prone to summer droughts and sudden fires, water became a matter of life and death. And for Rome to expand, it needed more than armies. It needed infrastructure that could move both men and water across vast distances. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had already built its first two aqueducts, the Aqua Appia and the Annio Vetus. These were not open canals, but carefully engineered channels of stone and concrete that used gravity to deliver water from distant springs. Some flowed entirely underground. Others crossed valleys on elevated arcades. Together, they fed fountains, baths, and cisterns across the growing city. For the army, clean and reliable water was a hidden weapon. Troops stationed near rivers or cities with aqueducts suffered fewer diseases, had faster recovery times, and could endure longer campaigns. Supply lines were built not just around roads, but around water access points. As Rome expanded into hotter, drier regions, the army often brought water before it brought war. Back in the capital, water was also a weapon against another deadly force: fire. Rome's early homes were made of wood and thatch, and city blocks were tightly packed. A single kitchen spark could become a neighborhood catastrophe. To combat this, water from aqueducts was stored in high-pressure tanks and public basins. These served as Rome's earliest firefighting tools. But firefighting was not yet organized. In many neighborhoods, it was the soldiers, or local civilians, who rushed in to stop the flames. Buckets were filled from fountains. Roof tiles were torn off to halt spreading embers. And in some cases, buildings were deliberately knocked down to create firebreaks. It was a primitive system, but it marked the beginning of Rome's understanding that infrastructure and defense were two sides of the same coin. Rome's leaders quickly saw that managing water was more than a civic duty. It was a show of power. Aqueducts were built to impress. They crossed valleys, pierced hills, and passed under city walls. Their presence declared order, discipline, and reach. Just like the legions, aqueducts marched into new territory as instruments of control. In time, the skills required to build these systems became part of the army itself. Roman engineers, trained to measure slopes, cut stone, and calculate flow, served not only in war, but in peacetime construction. Military engineers could dig trenches, raise bridges, and tap distant springs. They fought not just with weapons, but with water. Rome's empire was built with fire and steel, but it was sustained with stone, clay, and the steady rush of water from the hills. As Rome grew, its approach to water and fire evolved into a more deliberate system. Aqueducts multiplied and their capacity increased. The Aqua Marcia in 144 BCE was longer and more ambitious, bringing water from sources nearly 100 kilometers away into the heart of the city. Its sheer scale was a reminder that engineering had become as vital to Roman power as swords and shields. But moving water was only part of the challenge. Getting it where it was needed most was just as important. Public fountains were strategically placed at street corners and major intersections, ensuring that every district had access. Even simple dwellings could draw water nearby, a luxury that most other cities could not match. As these networks expanded, so did their role in public safety. Tanks and reservoirs filled at all hours, creating emergency supplies that could fight fires or support repair crews. Buckets and basins weren't just tools of the household anymore. They were tools of defense, kept filled and close at hand. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman leaders had begun to recognize the need for organization. Inspectors checked water pressure and cleanliness. Teams of workers were assigned to maintain fountains and repair leaks. This was the earliest blueprint of a public service, one that served the common good and enabled the city to grow without choking on its own size. The army continued to benefit. Soldiers who built aqueducts in times of peace could quickly switch to draining marshes or digging siege works during war. The engineering lessons they learned in Rome followed them abroad. From Narbo Martius, modern-day Narbonne, to Carthago Nova, modern-day Cartagena in Spain, Roman waterworks shaped towns that looked and felt like Rome itself. Soldiers and civilians alike came to see this as proof of Roman strength, not only in battle, but in brick and mortar. And if you'd like to dive deeper into how Rome built its aqueducts, managed its economy, or fought its infamous fires, we already have full-length audio documentaries on those topics. Check out our episodes on Roman waterworks and firefighting in the series library. They go into even greater detail on these fascinating parts of Roman life. By this stage, water and fire had become more than mere elements. Water was health, order, and endurance. Fire was a threat that tested the city's resilience. Together, they shaped a capital that was as prepared as it was proud. Every new stone aqueduct raised, every new reservoir dug, was a promise that Rome would not simply conquer, it would endure. Chapter 9. Rebuilding after the flames. Rome was no stranger to flames. In a city packed with wooden balconies, open flames, and crowded tenements, fire was as inevitable as rain, and when it came, it left nothing untouched. But what truly defined Rome was not the fire, it was what came after. Rebuilding was not just a civic duty, it became a military operation. After major fires, the Senate often mobilized local garrisons or consular legions stationed nearby to assist. These weren't emergency responders in the modern sense. They were trained soldiers, used to digging, lifting, and building. And they were fast. Within days, rubble was cleared, roads reopened, and key public spaces made usable again. For a city that never stopped moving, this speed was essential. The military's value in reconstruction came from its skills. Roman legionaries were not just fighters. They were also trained engineers, road layers, bridge builders, and surveyors. The same men who fortified distant borders with timber and stone were now stabilizing fire-damaged temples and rebuilding broken aqueduct sections inside the capital. Their work was precise, disciplined, and repeatable. The cohort system lent itself naturally to this kind of labor. Centurions assigned tasks to their units, who executed them with drill-like efficiency. Work was rotated in shifts. Toolkits were standardized. Camps set up temporary kitchens to feed the men while they worked in the burned districts. This wasn't just rebuilding, it was training. Commanders saw value in this. Rebuilding after fire was not only a public good, it also hardened troops. It kept their hands calloused, their backs strong, and their discipline sharp. Idle soldiers bred trouble, but working soldiers built cities and empires. Some units even became semi-permanent labor forces. In colonies and provincial capitals, local governors assigned legion detachments to construct forums, granaries, and temples, often after natural disasters or uprisings. Rome had no fire department, but it had something better, an army that built. This ability gave Roman leaders immense flexibility. A commander could send troops into a shattered district and restore basic infrastructure in days, while also projecting imperial authority. The sight of soldiers repairing fountains or stabilizing housing walls sent a message. Rome protects. Rome restores. The flames came and went, but every time they did, it was Roman soldiers, calloused, sweating, and silent, who rebuilt the stones beneath the city's feet. Their legacy lies not only in the provinces they conquered, but in the streets of Rome itself. Reconstruction was never just about bricks and beams. In the Roman world, rebuilding after destruction was a performance of power, and the military played its role on center stage. Legionaries worked not only as laborers, but as symbols. Their presence in burned districts reassured the public that order had returned, and that Rome would not fall to fire. This presence had psychological weight. Citizens saw rows of soldiers clearing debris, carving stones, or laying bricks, and knew the state had not abandoned them. These men, hardened by war, were now taming chaos. It was a reminder that Rome was not a city of merchants or mobs. It was a city held together by discipline. The military's involvement also brought technical advantages. Many soldiers had first-hand experience constructing fortifications, siege ramps, or supply depots in foreign campaigns. That experience translated into speed and precision. Materials were sorted quickly. Rubble became fill. Temporary scaffolding rose where walls had collapsed. The same ingenuity that built roads through the Alps was now rebuilding instantly in the heart of Rome. Officers treated reconstruction like a campaign. Teams were assigned specific zones. Progress was monitored. Mistakes were corrected with the same stern resolve as during battlefield drills. This transformed Rome into a city where military engineering and civic recovery became one and the same. Not all soldiers welcomed the duty. Some grumbled. There was no glory in laying stone, no cheers, no triumphs. But commanders understood that these moments built cohesion. They reminded the troops that discipline wasn't just about killing, it was about building and rebuilding the very world they fought to protect. At times, fire became the excuse to reshape entire neighborhoods. In some cases, army engineers weren't just restoring what had been lost, they were redrawing the urban map. Streets were straightened, alleyways widened, new squares or plazas inserted. It was fire that cleared the space, but it was the army that remade it. In provinces across the empire, similar patterns emerged. After earthquakes, floods, or rebellion, it was Roman soldiers who arrived with tools instead of swords. They dug drainage channels, shored up broken walls, or rebuilt bridges. Rebuilding was a ritual of stability, one that sent a clear message: Rome is still here. And while the flames threatened the city's breath, it was the army that kept its heart beating. In that sense, a Roman soldier's role in fire recovery was as essential as holding the front line, maybe even more so. After all, survival in Rome wasn't just about defeating enemies, it was about enduring, which, let's be honest, makes rebuilding almost as vital as subscribing to our channel. Chapter 10: Lessons of Fire. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, the Roman army had become something astonishing. It had risen from a tribal militia defending muddy hills to a force that dominated nearly the entire Italian peninsula. Its formations had evolved from rigid lines into a living, breathing battlefield machine. Its soldiers weren't just fighters. They were builders, engineers, and symbols of state power. The manipular legion had proven itself in every kind of terrain, in the hills of Samnium, on the coasts of Magna Graecia, across rivers, forests, and smoking ruins. Fire, whether in the form of city-wide infernos, shattered villages, or the destruction of old traditions, had been Rome's harshest teacher. And Rome had listened. Every defeat was studied. Every setback became a lesson. No other ancient power turned misfortune into doctrine with such brutal precision. These lessons were written not just in scrolls, but in stone and blood. Aqueducts carried water into neighborhoods once lost to fire. Barracks replaced thatched huts. Brick became law. And wherever a soldier stood, from the forum to the farthest outpost, he stood not just for Rome's safety, but for its rebirth after every crisis. But victory had a cost. As Rome's borders expanded, so did its burdens. Wars dragged on. New enemies rose before the old ones were even buried. The manipular system, once so adaptive, began to strain. It demanded citizen farmers who no longer existed. It required unpaid service from men who returned to find their homes repossessed and their land sold off to wealthy elites. Discontent simmered in the fields, in the ranks, and in the Senate itself. And then came the shadows. Across the sea, a general was preparing a force that would challenge the very soul of Rome, not from the front, but from the flank. In the coming years, elephants would cross snowbound mountains. Entire Roman armies would vanish in foreign soil. Italy itself would burn, and the Republic would tremble. And within Rome, power was shifting. Ambition grew bolder. Generals began to ask, what if soldiers owed loyalty not to the state, but to a man? What if land, food, and promises could buy an army? These were no longer distant threats. They were already here. The Republic would face its greatest enemy, not on the plains of battle, but in the choices it made about its own army. Could a citizen-soldier model survive in a world of empires? Could Rome remain a republic when its legions were growing more professional and more personal? With every campaign, the system that had built Rome was about to be reforged, not by fire, but by law. That story begins in part 2 of this trilogy, when the name Gaius Marius first echoes through the forum. Subscribe now, because the next battle won't be against a foreign enemy. It will be against the very idea of what a Roman soldier is.